Picture the moment when absolute devotion collides with invisible technology, when pilots who had sworn to die for their emperor suddenly found themselves facing weapons that seemed to possess an otherworldly intelligence. This is the story of the Japanese kamikaze attacks of late 1944 and early 1945, when the divine wind met an American secret so closely guarded that even friendly nations didn't know it existed. The proximity fuse would transform naval warfare forever, turning what should have been devastating suicide attacks into technological massacres that stunned even the most seasoned warriors of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1944 painted the Pacific with the colors of desperation. Admiral Takijiro Onishi stood on the deck of the carrier Zuikaku, watching the sun dip toward the horizon like a crimson sphere of molten steel. Around him, the remnants of Japan's once mighty combined fleet bobbed on gentle swells, their hulls scarred by months of relentless American advance. The Emperor's navy, which had once stretched its dominion from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, now found itself pressed back toward the very shores of the homeland. The mathematics of war had become brutal and unforgiving. American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace that defied imagination, while Japan's industrial capacity withered under the weight of blockade and bombing. For every Japanese pilot trained, 10 Americans took to the skies. For every ton of steel Japan could forge into warships, America produced 20. The numbers told a story that no amount of Bushido spirit could rewrite, yet surrender remained unthinkable. Onishi had seen the intelligence reports from the recent battles around the Philippine Sea. American task forces now operated with an audacity that bordered on contempt, their carriers steaming within range of land-based aircraft, their battleships bombarding Japanese positions with impunity. The technological gap had widened into a chasm. American radar could track incoming aircraft from 100 miles away. Their fighters possessed performance advantages that made dogfighting suicidal, and their anti-aircraft defenses had evolved into walls of steel that seemed impenetrable. But there was one weapon the Americans had never faced, one tactic that could potentially neutralize their material advantages through sheer force of will. The concept had been whispered in staff meetings and debated in the war colleges, but never officially sanctioned. It violated every conventional principle of naval aviation, every doctrine that had been drilled into Japanese pilots since their first training flights. Yet as Onishi watched the last light fade from the western sky, he knew that conventional warfare had already failed. The idea was both simple and terrible: transform the aircraft themselves into weapons. A fighter loaded with explosives and guided by a pilot willing to die could theoretically sink any ship in the American fleet. No defensive fire could stop a man who was already dead. No evasive maneuver could throw off a missile that could think and adapt. The human guidance system would be infinitely more precise than any mechanical device, infinitely more determined than any programmed torpedo.
Imperial Japanese Navy. The concept of death before dishonor was woven into the very fabric of military service, reinforced by centuries of samurai tradition and refined by decades of modern military indoctrination. Young pilots had been raised on stories of heroes who had sacrificed themselves for the emperor, who had chosen death over surrender, who had found immortal glory in moments of ultimate sacrifice. What Onishi proposed was not entirely alien to their worldview. It was simply the logical extension of principles they had already accepted. Yet the decision to formalize these tactics represented a crossing of the Rubicon, an acknowledgement that Japan's situation had become so desperate that extraordinary measures were not just justified, but necessary. The Special Attack Units, as they would be officially designated, represented both the ultimate expression of Japanese martial spirit and a tacit admission that conventional methods had failed. They were born from desperation, but cloaked in the rhetoric of honor, presented not as acts of despair, but as manifestations of the highest form of patriotic service. Lieutenant Commander Motoharu Okamura became one of the first officers to volunteer for what would become known as the Kamikaze Corps. A veteran pilot with over 2,000 flight hours and 6 confirmed kills, Okamura possessed both the skill and the credibility to lead others into this unprecedented form of warfare. He had survived the carrier battles of 1942, witnessed the gradual erosion of Japanese air power, and understood better than most that traditional tactics were no longer viable against American technological superiority. The aircraft selected for these missions reflected Japan's increasingly constrained circumstances. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once the terror of the Pacific skies, had been relegated to suicide duties not because of its excellence, but because of its obsolescence. American fighters now outclassed it in every measurable category, except perhaps maneuverability. And even that advantage had been neutralized by new tactical doctrines that emphasized speed and altitude over dogfighting. The Zero's light construction, once prized for its agility and range, now made it vulnerable to even glancing hits from American guns. But those same characteristics that made it unsuitable for air-to-air combat made it perfect for suicide attacks. It was fast enough to close with enemy ships, maneuverable enough to evade initial defensive fire, and light enough to be modified with explosive charges without losing its flight characteristics. The Yokosuka D4Y Suisei dive bomber, known to the Americans as the Judy, also found new purpose in the kamikaze role. Originally designed for precision bombing attacks against enemy carriers, the Suisei possessed the speed and structural strength necessary to penetrate defensive screens and deliver devastating blows against capital ships. Its powerful engine could push it to speeds approaching 350 miles per hour in a dive, fast enough to complicate the tracking solutions of American gunners and give it a reasonable chance of reaching its target despite concentrated defensive fire. Training for these missions required a complete reconceptualization of pilot education. Traditional flight training emphasized survival skills, evasive maneuvers, and the preservation of both aircraft and pilot for future missions. Kamikaze training eliminated these considerations entirely, focusing instead on target identification, optimal approach angles, and the precise timing necessary to maximize damage upon impact. Pilots practiced diving attacks against mock-up ships, learning to recognize the vulnerable points on different classes of vessels and calculating the exact moment to commit to their final plunge. The psychological preparation proved even more challenging than the technical training. While Japanese military culture had long emphasized the nobility of death in service to the emperor, the systematic preparation for suicide required a level of mental conditioning that pushed even dedicated warriors to their limits. Group sessions were held in which pilots would encourage one another to embrace their suicide missions as a privilege, an opportunity to demonstrate their unwavering loyalty to the emperor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Where pilots discussed their motivations, reinforced their commitment to the mission, and shared their hopes for what their sacrifice might accomplish. Letters were written to families, personal effects were distributed, and final ceremonies were conducted with the solemnity appropriate to men who had already accepted their fate. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, serving as Onishi's chief of staff, had been tasked with developing the operational parameters for these attacks. His analysis of American fleet formations revealed both vulnerabilities and strengths that would influence kamikaze tactics. American carriers typically operated in the center of circular formations, protected by concentric rings of cruisers, destroyers, and escort vessels. The outer perimeter was patrolled by fighters flying combat air patrol, while the ships themselves bristled with anti-aircraft guns of various calibers. Breaking through such defenses would require careful coordination, precise timing, and the willingness to absorb enormous casualties in exchange for the chance to strike at high-value targets. The intelligence reports from recent engagements provided mixed signals about the effectiveness of American defensive fire. On one hand, American gunners had demonstrated remarkable accuracy against conventional bombing attacks, shooting down significant percentages of attacking aircraft before they could reach their release points. Their new generation of anti-aircraft guns seemed to possess both the rate of fire and the hitting power necessary to destroy incoming aircraft at considerable distances. Radar-directed fire control allowed them to engage targets even in poor visibility conditions, while proximity-fused shells eliminated the need for precise timing in their detonation. Yet these same reports also revealed potential weaknesses in American defensive doctrine. The circular formations that protected carriers also concentrated defensive fire, creating gaps at the boundaries between ships' fields of fire. Fast, low-flying aircraft might be able to exploit these gaps, especially if they approached from unexpected angles or during periods of reduced visibility. More importantly, American gunners had been trained to engage aircraft that were trying to survive their attacks. Pilots who would take evasive action, break off their runs, or attempt to escape after delivering their weapons. They had never faced attackers who were indifferent to defensive fire, who would maintain their course regardless of damage, who could not be deterred by the threat of destruction. The strategic context for these attacks was shaped by Japan's deteriorating position throughout the Pacific theater. American amphibious forces had seized airfields within bombing range of the Japanese home islands, while submarines had effectively severed the sea lanes that connected Japan's scattered empire. The economy was beginning to buckle under the strain of total war, with critical shortages of fuel, raw materials, and trained personnel affecting every aspect of the military effort. Under these circumstances, the Kamikaze represented not just a tactical innovation, but a strategic gamble. The hope that spectacular attacks against American naval forces might force a negotiated settlement before Japan's position became completely untenable. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had been monitoring Japanese communications with growing concern. While American cryptographers could not penetrate all of Japan's military codes, they had detected unusual patterns in radio traffic that suggested major changes in Japanese tactical doctrine. References to special attack units and decisive operations appeared with increasing frequency, though their exact meaning remained obscure. What was clear was that the Japanese were preparing something unprecedented, something that represented a significant departure from their previous methods of warfare. The American naval forces advancing across the Central Pacific had grown accustomed to Japanese air attacks that, while fierce, followed predictable patterns. Enemy bombers would approach at high altitude, dive toward their targets, release their weapons, and attempt to escape. Fighter escorts would engage American combat air patrols in dogfights that usually favored the Americans due to their superior aircraft and increasingly experienced pilots. Even when Japanese attackers penetrated the defensive screen, they typically pulled out of their dives after weapon release, giving gunners multiple opportunities to engage them during their approach and withdrawal. American anti-aircraft defenses had evolved dramatically since the early days of the war. The lessons learned at Pearl Harbor, where Japanese aircraft had operated almost unopposed, had driven a revolution in defensive technology and tactics. New generations of radar-controlled guns could track multiple targets simultaneously, while improved ammunition increased both the accuracy and lethality of defensive fire. The 5-inch 38th caliber dual-purpose guns that equipped most American cruisers and destroyers had proven particularly effective against aircraft, combining a high rate of fire with shells powerful enough to destroy even heavily armored targets. But the most significant advancement in American anti-aircraft capability was also the most secret. The proximity fuse, developed in laboratories far from the battlefields of the Pacific, represented a quantum leap in defensive technology. Unlike conventional anti-aircraft shells that required precise timing to detonate at the optimal distance from their targets, proximity-fused rounds contained miniature radar sets that could detect nearby aircraft and trigger detonation automatically. The technology was so sensitive and so valuable that its existence was known only to a handful of high-ranking officials, while its operational employment was restricted to overwater engagements where unexploded shells would not fall into enemy hands. Commander William Sterling, serving as gunnery officer aboard the heavy cruiser Baltimore, had been among the first American naval officers to witness the effectiveness of proximity fuses in combat. During a Japanese air raid near the Marshall Islands, his ship's 5-inch guns had achieved hit rates that seemed almost impossible under conventional circumstances. Shells that should have passed harmlessly by enemy aircraft instead detonated with devastating precision, creating lethal clouds of shrapnel that brought down attackers without requiring direct hits. The psychological effect on his gun crews had been profound. Men who had grown accustomed to the frustrations of long-range anti-aircraft fire suddenly found themselves achieving success rates that bordered on the miraculous. The development of the proximity fuse had begun in American research laboratories as early as 1940, driven by British requests for improved anti-aircraft ammunition. The technical challenges were immense, creating a radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, robust enough to survive the tremendous acceleration of being fired from a gun, and sensitive enough to detect aircraft at the optimal distance for maximum lethality. The solution required innovations in miniaturization, rugged electronics, and manufacturing techniques that pushed American industrial capability to its limits. Dr. Merle Tuve, leading the proximity fuse development program at the Applied Physics Laboratory, had faced skepticism from many quarters about the feasibility of his project. Artillery officers questioned whether such a complex system could function reliably under combat conditions, while production engineers worried about the cost and complexity of manufacturing radar-equipped ammunition in the quantities required by modern warfare. The breakthrough came through a combination of technical innovation and manufacturing ingenuity, creating a system that was both reliable and producible in large quantities. The operational testing of proximity fuses had been conducted under the strictest security protocols. Test firings were carried out over remote ocean areas where any unexploded ammunition would sink harmlessly to the bottom.
The results were classified at levels typically reserved for the most sensitive intelligence operations. Even the gun crews who fired the new ammunition were not informed about its special capabilities. They were simply told that they were testing improved anti-aircraft rounds with better fragmentation patterns. The first combat employment of proximity fuses had occurred during the Solomon Islands campaign, where American cruisers and destroyers had achieved unprecedented success rates against Japanese aircraft. The enemy pilots, accustomed to the relatively predictable patterns of conventional anti-aircraft fire, found themselves facing defensive barrages that seemed to anticipate their every move. Shells that should have missed by comfortable margins instead exploded with lethal precision, creating kill zones that made successful attacks increasingly difficult to execute. Japanese intelligence officers had noted the apparent improvement in American anti-aircraft effectiveness, but had attributed it to better training, improved fire control systems, or simple statistical variation. The possibility that the Americans had developed a fundamentally new type of ammunition was considered, but dismissed as technically impractical.
Japanese scientists working under increasingly constrained circumstances found it difficult to imagine that their enemies had achieved breakthrough innovations that they themselves had not even attempted. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, had noticed the change during a reconnaissance mission over American fleet formations near Guadalcanal. The anti-aircraft fire seemed different somehow, more accurate and more lethal than anything he had encountered during the early stages of the war. Explosions occurred at precisely the right distances to maximize damage, while the timing seemed almost supernatural in its precision. He reported these observations to his superiors, but received little attention. The focus was on more pressing tactical concerns, and unusual anti-aircraft fire patterns seemed relatively minor compared to the broader challenges facing Japanese air power. The strategic implications of the proximity fuse extended far beyond its immediate tactical applications. American naval forces equipped with this technology possessed a defensive advantage that was largely invisible to their enemies, a secret capability that would only become apparent when Japanese pilots found themselves flying into walls of precisely timed explosions. The psychological impact on enemy aircrew would be enormous once they realized that their traditional attack methods were no longer viable, while the operational consequences would force fundamental changes in Japanese tactical doctrine. As 1944 drew to a close, both sides were preparing for confrontations that would test the limits of their respective capabilities. The Japanese, driven by desperation and guided by a warrior ethos that valued honor over survival, were preparing to launch the most unconventional air campaign in naval history. The Americans, protected by secret technology and sustained by industrial might, were advancing toward the Japanese home islands with confidence in their technological superiority. Neither side fully understood what they were about to face, and neither was prepared for the collision between ancient codes of honor and cutting-edge science that would define the final phase of the Pacific War. The stage was set for battles that would reveal the true nature of modern warfare, where technological innovation could trump even the most fanatical dedication, where invisible radio waves could defeat the most determined human spirit. The kamikaze pilots who would soon take off from Japanese airfields had no knowledge of the proximity fuses waiting for them aboard American ships. They flew toward their targets with absolute confidence in their mission, absolute faith in their cause, and absolute ignorance of the scientific revolution that was about to render their sacrifice less effective than they had ever imagined possible. Captain Tadashi Nakajima stood in the Combat Information Center of the escort carrier USS St. Lo,
briefing room of the Mabalacat airfield in the Philippines, facing 30 young men who had volunteered for humanity's most desperate gambit. The walls were decorated with photographs of the emperor and slogans exhorting absolute loyalty to the divine throne, but the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. These pilots had already passed through the psychological crucible of accepting their own deaths. What remained was the technical preparation for their final mission. The intelligence maps spread across the briefing table showed the disposition of American naval forces approaching Leyte Gulf. Task Force 38, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, represented the most powerful naval formation ever assembled, with fast carriers, modern battleships, and dozens of escort vessels arranged in defensive formations that had proven devastatingly effective against conventional air attacks. The fleet possessed more aircraft than the entire remaining strength of Japanese naval aviation, while its defensive firepower exceeded anything previously deployed in naval warfare. Yet Nakajima and his superiors believed they had identified weaknesses in this seemingly impregnable formation. American defensive doctrine relied on layered protection, combat air patrols to engage incoming aircraft at long range, followed by concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the ships themselves. The system was designed to deal with aircraft that would attempt to survive their attacks, pilots who could be deterred by defensive fire, or who would break off their runs when faced with overwhelming opposition. It had never been tested against attackers who were indifferent to their own survival, who would press their attacks regardless of damage or opposition.
The aircraft assigned to this mission reflected the desperate improvisation that characterized Japanese operations in late 1944. The Zeros were veterans of hundreds of combat missions, their airframes patched and repaired repeatedly as spare parts became increasingly scarce. The engines were running on fuel of questionable quality, mixed with additives that extended supply but reduced reliability. The pilots themselves were a mixture of experienced veterans and hastily trained replacements, united only by their willingness to die for the Emperor. Lieutenant Yukio Seki had been selected to lead the first official Kamikaze mission, a choice that reflected both his skill as a pilot and his acceptance of the role that fate had assigned him. A graduate of the Naval Academy with over 800 flight hours, Seki possessed the technical expertise necessary to penetrate American defenses and the leadership qualities needed to inspire others to follow him into certain death. His final letter to his wife spoke not of regret or fear, but of honor and duty, expressing his hope that his sacrifice would contribute to Japan's ultimate victory. The modifications made to the Kamikaze aircraft were crude but effective. Armor plating was removed to save weight, while additional fuel tanks were installed to extend range. Most significantly, each aircraft carried a 250-kilogram bomb secured to the fuselage, transforming the plane into a guided missile with a human guidance system. The pilots were instructed to aim for the most vulnerable parts of enemy ships, the flight decks of carriers, the bridge structures of cruisers, or the ammunition magazines of destroyers. A successful hit could potentially sink or disable vessels worth millions of dollars and thousands of lives. The psychological preparation for these missions involved rituals that honored both ancient tradition and modern military requirements. Pilots participated in ceremonial sake toasts, wrote final letters to their families, and received blessed headbands inscribed with prayers for success in battle. The atmosphere was solemn but not morbid. These men viewed themselves not as suicide bombers, but as warriors embracing the highest form of military service. Their deaths would have meaning only if they achieved their tactical objectives, turning their aircraft into weapons that could strike decisive blows against the enemy fleet.
Suggested that American anti-aircraft fire, while intense and accurate, was not insurmountable. Japanese pilots who had survived previous attacks reported that defensive barrages, although deadly, created patterns that could be analyzed and exploited. Ships' guns had limited angles of depression, creating zones of relative safety for aircraft approaching at very low altitudes. More importantly, American gunners appeared to follow predictable engagement sequences, concentrating first on the most obvious threats while potentially overlooking aircraft that approached from unexpected directions. The timing of the kamikaze attacks had been carefully calculated to maximize their impact. American carriers were most vulnerable during aircraft recovery operations, when their flight decks were crowded with planes and their defensive attention was focused on managing air traffic rather than repelling attacks. The approach routes had been planned to exploit blind spots in radar coverage, following terrain features that would mask the attackers until they were too close for effective defensive engagement. Weather conditions were favorable for low-level flight, with scattered clouds that could provide concealment during the initial stages of the attack. Commander Asaichi Tamai, responsible for coordinating the kamikaze operations, had studied American defensive patterns with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. He had identified what appeared to be temporal rhythms in their combat air patrols, periods when fighter coverage was reduced due to fuel limitations or pilot fatigue. The attack would be timed to coincide with these windows of vulnerability, maximizing the chances that the kamikaze aircraft could penetrate the outer defensive perimeter and reach their targets. The strategic objectives of the kamikaze campaign extended beyond the immediate tactical goals of sinking American ships. Japanese leadership hoped that spectacular attacks against the American fleet would demonstrate Japan's continuing capacity for resistance, potentially influencing American public opinion and creating pressure for a negotiated settlement. The psychological impact on American sailors who witnessed kamikaze attacks would presumably be enormous, while the logistical consequences of losing major fleet units might force the Americans to reconsider their strategy of direct assault against Japan's home islands. Yet, even as these preparations continued, American defensive capabilities were evolving in ways that remained invisible to Japanese intelligence. The proximity fuses that had been tested so successfully against conventional air attacks were being deployed in increasing numbers throughout the Pacific Fleet. Gun crews were receiving new ammunition with instructions that provided no hint of its revolutionary capabilities, while fire control systems were being calibrated to optimize the employment of the new technology. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, had been briefed on the proximity fuse program during a classified meeting at Pearl Harbor. The demonstration had been conducted using target drones flying at various altitudes and speeds, replicating the performance characteristics of Japanese aircraft. The results had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Hit rates improved by factors of 5 or more, while the effective range of anti-aircraft guns increased dramatically. Ships that had previously struggled to defend themselves against determined air attacks could now create defensive zones that seemed virtually impenetrable. The security protocols surrounding proximity fuses remained extraordinary even by wartime standards. The ammunition was transported in special containers marked only with innocuous technical designations, while the firing instructions were distributed through channels normally reserved for the most sensitive intelligence materials. Gun crews were told simply that they were receiving improved anti-aircraft rounds with enhanced fragmentation characteristics, explanations that satisfied curiosity without revealing the true nature of the technology.
Captain Frederick Sherman, commanding the carrier Essex, had witnessed the effectiveness of proximity fuses during recent operations in the Central Pacific. His ship's escort vessels had achieved defensive success rates that bordered on the miraculous, shooting down attacking aircraft with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The psychological effect on his crew had been profound. Sailors who had grown accustomed to the terrifying uncertainty of air attacks now watched with growing confidence as enemy aircraft fell to defensive fire with unprecedented regularity. The implications of this technological advantage extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. American naval forces equipped with proximity fuses possessed a defensive capability that was largely invisible to their enemies, a secret weapon that would only reveal itself when Japanese pilots found themselves flying into precisely timed explosions. The strategic consequences would become apparent only when kamikaze attacks, planned and executed with meticulous care, encountered defensive systems that had evolved far beyond anything the Japanese could imagine. The morning of October 25, 1944, dawned clear and bright over Leyte Gulf, the waters reflecting the pale gold of sunrise like a mirror crafted from liquid metal. Aboard the escort carrier St. Lo, radioman second-class Thomas McKenna adjusted his headset and scanned the frequencies for any unusual transmissions. The American fleet had been on high alert for days, intelligence reports suggesting that the Japanese were preparing some form of major air offensive, though the exact nature remained unclear. What McKenna and his shipmates could not have known was that invisible radio waves, no larger than whispers in the electromagnetic spectrum, were about to rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Lieutenant Yukio Seki completed his final pre-flight inspection of the Zero fighter that would carry him to immortality. The aircraft bore the Rising Sun insignia with pride, though its fabric-covered control surfaces showed the wear of countless missions and hasty repairs. Beneath the fuselage, the 250-kilogram bomb sat like a steel promise, its fusing mechanism armed and ready to detonate upon impact. Around him, 29 other pilots made similar preparations, their movements calm and deliberate despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. They had transcended fear during the weeks of psychological conditioning,
reaching a state of acceptance that bordered on the mystical. Captain Kiichi Hasegawa, commanding the air group at Mabalacat, watched his pilots with a mixture of pride and profound sadness. These young men represented the finest traditions of Japanese military service, yet their sacrifice seemed to embody both the nobility and the tragedy of their nation's situation. The empire that had once commanded half the Pacific now found itself reduced to trading the lives of its best and brightest for the slim hope of inflicting enough damage to force a negotiated peace. The mathematics of attrition had become inescapable. Japan was running out of experienced pilots faster than it could train replacements. The intelligence briefing had been thorough but ultimately incomplete. American Task Force 77, centered around the escort carriers providing air support for the Leyte invasion, represented a target of unprecedented value. The destruction of even a few carriers could disrupt the entire amphibious operation, potentially forcing the Americans to withdraw or delay their advance toward the Japanese home islands. The defensive capabilities of these ships were well documented: 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors cannons, and 20mm Oerlikon automatic weapons, all coordinated by radar-directed fire control systems that had proven increasingly effective against conventional air attacks. What the intelligence reports could not reveal was the true nature of the ammunition now filling the magazines of American warships. The proximity fuses had been deployed with such secrecy that even many American officers remained unaware of their existence. The shells
looked identical to conventional anti-aircraft rounds, distinguished only by subtle markings that meant nothing to casual observers. Yet inside each projectile, miniature radar transmitters waited to unleash a revolution in defensive warfare. Commander William Thomas, gunnery officer aboard the destroyer Samuel B. Roberts, had noticed the unusual accuracy of his ship's 5-inch guns during recent engagements, but attributed it to improved training and better fire control equipment. His gun crews had achieved hit rates that seemed almost miraculous, bringing down Japanese aircraft with precision that defied statistical probability. The proximity fuses remained so classified that even Thomas, responsible for their employment, had not been informed of their true capabilities. He simply knew that his new ammunition was remarkably effective. The Kamikaze formation began its takeoff sequence at precisely 0630 hours, each aircraft lifting off from the Mabalacat runway with engines straining under the weight of extra fuel and explosive ordnance. Lieutenant Seki led the formation into a climbing turn toward the northeast, where American radar operators would first detect them as faint blips on green cathode ray screens. The pilots maintained radio silence, communicating through hand signals and predetermined flight patterns that had been rehearsed until they became instinctive. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet from his flagship Wasatch, received the first radar contact reports at 0745 hours. Approximately 30 aircraft were approaching from the southwest at low altitude, their flight profile consistent with a coordinated attack against the escort carrier groups. The defensive protocols activated automatically. Combat air patrols were vectored toward the incoming formation, while ships began maneuvering into defensive formations optimized for anti-aircraft engagement. The Grumman F-6F Hellcats of Fighter Squadron 27 were the first to encounter Seki's formation, intercepting the Japanese aircraft approximately 40 miles from the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading the American fighters, immediately recognized something unusual about the enemy formation. The Japanese pilots were flying with a determination that seemed almost mechanical, maintaining course and altitude despite the approach of superior American fighters. Previous encounters had always involved some form of evasive maneuvering, but these aircraft continued straight toward their targets as if the presence of interceptors was irrelevant. The air battle that followed defied conventional patterns of fighter combat. The Zero pilots, instead of attempting to engage the American fighters in traditional dogfighting, focused entirely on penetrating toward the fleet. They absorbed losses without deviation, watching their comrades spiral into the sea while maintaining their disciplined formation.
McCampbell and his pilots found themselves facing opponents who fought not to win, but simply to reach their targets, a tactical approach that rendered many conventional fighter tactics ineffective. Seki's formation, reduced from 30 aircraft to 18 by the fighter interception, broke through the combat air patrol and began their final approach toward the escort carriers. The ships appeared as gray silhouettes against the blue water, their angular superstructures bristling with anti-aircraft guns that were already beginning to track the incoming attackers. The moment had arrived when months of preparation, weeks of psychological conditioning, and centuries of military tradition would collide with the most closely guarded secret in the American arsenal. Gunner's Mate First Class Robert Harrison, manning the 5-inch gun director aboard the escort carrier Cullinan Bay, acquired his first target at a range of 12,000 yards. The Japanese aircraft was approaching in a shallow dive, its speed increasing as it committed to its attack run. Harrison's training had taught him to calculate lead angles, to anticipate evasive maneuvers, and to time his shots
for maximum probability of interception. What his training had not prepared him for was ammunition that would think for itself. The first proximity-fused shell left the barrel of the 5-inch gun at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, its miniature radar transmitter activating as the projectile reached a safe distance from the firing ship. The radio waves pulsed outward at the speed of light, creating an invisible detection zone that extended in all directions from the shell's trajectory. When the reflected signals indicated the presence of a metallic object within lethal range, the fuse would trigger detonation with precision measured in milliseconds. Lieutenant Seki, focused entirely on his target, never saw the shell that killed him. The proximity fuse detected his aircraft when the Zero was still 80 feet from the projectile's path, triggering an explosion that filled the air with deadly fragments of steel. The blast shredded his engine, severed his control cables, and turned his cockpit into a storm of flying metal. His aircraft, mortally wounded but still carrying its bomb, tumbled out of control toward the sea, its pilot already dead behind the controls. The scene repeated itself across the battle space as proximity fuses revealed their devastating effectiveness against attackers who could not be deterred by defensive fire. Shells that should have missed by comfortable margins instead detonated with lethal precision, creating kill zones that seemed to anticipate the movements of their targets. The kamikaze pilots, trained to ignore conventional anti-aircraft fire, found themselves facing defensive barrages that possessed an almost supernatural accuracy. Ensign Hiroshi Yamamoto, flying Seki's wing, watched his leader's aircraft disintegrate in a flash of flame and smoke, but maintained his own attack course with unwavering determination. His target, the escort carrier Gambier Bay, grew larger in his windscreen as he pushed his Zero into a steep diving attack. The ship's anti-aircraft guns were firing continuously now, filling the air with streams of tracer fire and the black puffs of exploding shells. Yet something seemed different about this defensive fire, more precise and more lethal than anything he had encountered during training exercises against mock targets. The proximity fuse that ended Yamamoto's life triggered when his aircraft was still 100 yards from impact with the carrier's flight deck. The explosion occurred directly beneath his engine, the blast wave crushing the Zero's lightweight structure and killing the pilot instantly. His bomb, armed for contact detonation, exploded harmlessly in the water as the wreckage struck the sea 50 yards from the Gambier Bay's starboard side. Chief Petty Officer William Sullivan, commanding a 40mm gun mount aboard the destroyer Hull, watched in amazement as Japanese aircraft fell from the sky with unprecedented regularity. His crew had been trained to expect that only a small percentage of their shots would achieve direct hits, yet the incoming kamikaze formation was being systematically destroyed by defensive fire that seemed impossibly accurate. Sullivan had no knowledge of proximity fuses, but he could see their effects as shells exploded with perfect timing all around the attacking aircraft.
The mathematical precision of the proximity fuse technology became apparent as the battle progressed. Traditional anti-aircraft fire required direct hits or very near misses to achieve lethal effects, limiting the effective kill radius of each shell to a few yards at most. Proximity fuses expanded this radius dramatically, creating kill zones that could destroy aircraft even when the shell's trajectory was significantly off target. The improvement in hit probability was so dramatic that it fundamentally altered the balance between offensive and defensive capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, leading the second wave of kamikaze aircraft, had witnessed the destruction of Seki's formation from a distance of several miles. The defensive fire appeared more intense than intelligence reports had suggested, while the rate of aircraft losses seemed unusually high for such an early stage of the attack.
Yet his orders were explicit. Press the attack regardless of casualties. Achieve hits against high-value targets, and trust that sufficient numbers would penetrate the defensive screen to accomplish the mission. The escort carrier St. Lo became the focus of Nakamura's formation as they began their final approach. The ship had been maneuvering to avoid the first wave of attackers, her crew manning every anti-aircraft weapon, while damage control parties stood ready to respond to hits. Captain Francis McKenna, commanding the St. Lo, had watched proximity fuses destroy most of the first attack wave, though he remained unaware of the technology that had saved his ship. To his eyes, it simply appeared that his gunners had achieved unprecedented accuracy under the pressure of combat. Seaman First Class Anthony Potenza, loading 5-inch ammunition in the St. Lo's forward gun mount, had no idea that the shells he was handling contained radar systems more sophisticated than anything in most American aircraft. The proximity fuses looked identical to conventional anti-aircraft rounds, distinguished only by subtle markings that had no meaning to enlisted personnel. Yet each shell represented months of research, development, and testing, culminating in a weapon that could think and react faster than any human operator. The third kamikaze to reach the St. Lo penetrated closer to the ship than any previous attacker, his Zero surviving multiple proximity fuse detonations that should have destroyed it outright. Petty Officer Third Class Kiyoshi Ogawa had been wounded by shell fragments early in his approach, his engine trailing smoke and his controls partially damaged, yet his aircraft remained airworthy enough to continue the attack. The proximity fuses had wounded his plane, but not destroyed it completely, creating the possibility that one attacker might finally reach its target. The final seconds of Ogawa's life unfolded with the terrible clarity that comes to men facing certain death. His aircraft, battered by defensive fire but still under control, lined up on the St. Lo's flight deck while proximity-fused shells exploded all around him. The defensive fire was so intense that the air itself seemed solid with steel fragments, yet somehow his Zero continued flying, carried forward by momentum and the determination of its dying pilot. The proximity fuse that should have killed Ogawa malfunctioned, a 1 in 10,000 failure that allowed his aircraft to penetrate the final 100 yards to its target. The Zero, trailing fire and smoke, crashed through the St. Lo's flight deck and into the hangar bay below, where its 250-kilogram bomb detonated among aircraft being serviced and refueled. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline and ordnance, creating a chain reaction that would ultimately doom the escort carrier despite the proximity fuses that had protected her from dozens of other attackers. The St. Lo's death throes were visible for miles as secondary explosions tore through her hull and superstructure. The single kamikaze hit that had penetrated the proximity fuse defenses triggered a catastrophic sequence that sent the 10,000-ton carrier to the bottom within 30 minutes. Yet even this success came at an unprecedented cost. 29 other kamikaze aircraft had been destroyed by defensive fire before reaching their targets, a casualty rate that would have been inconceivable under conventional anti-aircraft engagement. Captain McKenna, abandoning his burning ship, could see other kamikaze formations approaching from the south and west.
The proximity fuses had performed beyond all expectations, destroying the vast majority of attacking aircraft before they could complete their missions. Yet the sheer scale of the Japanese offensive meant that even a small percentage of successful penetrations could inflict serious damage on the American fleet. The fourth wave of kamikaze attacks encountered American defensive fire that had been calibrated by the experience of previous engagements. Gun crews, initially surprised by the unusual effectiveness of their ammunition, had begun to adapt their aiming techniques to maximize the impact of the new shells.
To adjust their firing patterns to maximize the employment of proximity fuses. The result was defensive zones that seemed virtually impenetrable to aircraft approaching at conventional attack speeds and altitudes. Lieutenant Saburo Nakamura, leading 12 aircraft toward the escort carriers, found his formation disintegrating under defensive fire that defied all previous experience. Proximity-fused shells were exploding with mechanical precision, creating overlapping kill zones that left no path of approach uncovered by lethal fragments. His aircraft, like those of his comrades, was struck repeatedly by metal shards that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The psychological impact on the surviving kamikaze pilots proved as devastating as the physical destruction of their aircraft. These men had prepared themselves to die, accepting their fate with the calm resignation of those who had transcended fear. What they had not prepared for was the possibility that their sacrifice might be rendered meaningless by defensive technologies they could neither see nor understand. The proximity fuses struck them down, not with the dramatic finality of direct hits, but with the invisible precision of science applied to warfare. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, monitoring the battle from his command post at Mabalakat, received fragmentary reports that painted a picture of unprecedented disaster. Radio transmissions from the attacking formations had ceased almost immediately upon contact with American defensive fire, while reconnaissance aircraft reported seeing dozens of aircraft wreckage scattered across the waters around the enemy fleet. The attack that was supposed to demonstrate Japan's continuing capacity for decisive action had instead revealed the technological gulf that now separated the two combatants. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Task Force 38 from his flagship New Jersey, received damage reports that seemed almost too good to believe. Despite facing the largest kamikaze offensive mounted to date, his force had suffered minimal losses while destroying the vast majority of attacking aircraft. The proximity fuses had performed flawlessly, creating defensive capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the scientists who had developed them. The strategic implications of the proximity fuse's combat debut extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing the fragmentary reports from surviving pilots and reconnaissance aircraft, could detect that something fundamental had changed in American defensive capabilities. The casualty rates suffered by kamikaze formations were so severe that they called into question the entire concept of suicide attacks against well-defended targets. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, responsible for analyzing the results of kamikaze operations, faced a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. American anti-aircraft fire had apparently improved by orders of magnitude almost overnight, achieving hit rates that seemed to violate the statistical principles upon which Japanese tactical planning was based. The possibility that the Americans had developed some form of revolutionary ammunition was considered but dismissed as technically impractical given the constraints of existing technology. The human cost of the proximity fuse's success was measured not only in Japanese casualties, but in American lives saved. Ships that should have been sunk or heavily damaged remained operational, their crews protected by invisible radio waves that detected approaching threats with superhuman precision. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen.
If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.